I was 16 when my mom left, and for a while, I thought the worst part of it would be watching my dad try to figure out how to be a single parent. We lived in a 2-story house in Ohio. It wasn't a particularly big house, and there was nothing unusual about it. My dad had bought it a few years before everything happened, and my mom had helped pick out most of the furniture. After she moved out, a lot of that stuff stayed exactly where it had always been, which made the house feel strange for a while. Her pictures eventually came down, but there were still little things around that belonged to her. A few decorations, some kitchen stuff, and random things that nobody had bothered moving. She had started seeing somebody else. I never really knew how long it had been going on before my dad found out, because neither of them ever gave me the full story. There were arguments, then a few weeks where they barely spoke to each other, and eventually my mom moved out. She didn't go far away, but she wasn't around much anymore. My dad didn't handle the whole thing particularly well. He wasn't the kind of person who talked about his feelings, so instead of talking about them, he worked more. He picked up extra shifts whenever they were available, especially overnight jobs, which meant I spent a lot of evenings by myself. I was a junior in high school at the time. I'd go to school, come home, do homework when I felt like it, talk to a couple of friends online, and spend way too much time on my laptop. I had one close friend named Kayla who lived about 10 minutes away. We'd known each other since middle school, and before my mom left, she used to come over pretty often. After everything happened, she still came over, but I noticed that she usually asked whether my dad was home before deciding if she wanted to stay. She didn't like the house anymore. I didn't really blame her, although I never understood why. There was nothing creepy about the place. It was in a completely normal neighborhood with houses fairly close together. There was a grocery store a few minutes away, a gas station at the end of the road, and a school bus stop around the corner. Our house had 3 bedrooms upstairs. My room was at the front of the house, and my dad's bedroom was across the hallway. The stairs came up from the living room and ended at the top of that hallway. There was a small bathroom between our bedrooms. The back door was downstairs, through the kitchen. At the time, I didn't think much about the locks. There was a deadbolt on both the front and back doors. My dad always locked them before going to bed, but I wasn't particularly careful about it myself. I'd sometimes take the trash out through the back door and come back inside without thinking twice about whether I'd locked it behind me. I'd gotten into the habit of staying up really late. My dad worked for a company that handled commercial buildings, and his schedule changed constantly. I remember my dad getting ready for work because he'd been complaining about being tired all week. He'd eaten dinner in front of the television, then went upstairs to change while I sat at the kitchen table doing nothing useful. When he came back downstairs, he was already wearing his work clothes. He told me he probably wouldn't be home until sometime after 6 in the morning. Before leaving, he checked the back door, pulled on the handle, and told me to lock it after he left. I know. He looked at me. I'm serious. I know. He laughed a little, grabbed his keys, and walked outside. I watched his truck pull out of the driveway from the front window. Once his taillights disappeared, the house felt different. It always did when he worked overnight. I wasn't scared of being alone. I'd been alone plenty of times before. I got some food, watched television, and talked to Kayla over text. I remember lying on the couch laughing at some of the messages she was sending me. Eventually, she stopped replying because she had to get up early the next morning. I went upstairs sometime around midnight. I had school the next day, but I wasn't tired. I opened my laptop and started watching a show I'd been watching for a few days. I downloaded it because the internet connection in our neighborhood was terrible, and I didn't want the episode constantly buffering. I watched one episode, then another. Around 2 in the morning, I was still awake. My room had one window facing the street. Every now and then, headlights from a passing car would shine across the ceiling. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention to that. That night, I did. I think being alone makes you notice things you normally wouldn't. At some point, I paused the show because I thought I wanted something to drink. I sat there for a minute trying to decide if I was actually thirsty enough to go downstairs. I wasn't. so I kept watching. A little after 3 in the morning, I heard something downstairs. There was a sound from the back of the house. I took my headphones off. A few seconds later, I heard the back door opening. My first thought was that my dad had come home. That was the obvious. I felt relieved for a second because I assumed he'd finished work early. But I remembered that his truck hadn't been in the driveway when I'd looked outside earlier. I sat there listening. The back door made a quiet scraping sound as it opened, followed by the sound of somebody stepping onto the kitchen floor. That was when I realized it was definitely somebody. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the pipes. There were footsteps. The person downstairs walked into the kitchen. Then I heard a cabinet open. For some reason, I still tried to convince myself it was my dad. Maybe he'd come home without me noticing. He'd parked somewhere else. He'd left his truck at work and gotten a ride home. But something about the way this person was moving didn't sound like him. My dad was loud when he came home. He dropped his keys on the counter, kicked his shoes off, opened the refrigerator, and usually made enough noise that I knew he was home without him having to say anything. This person was quiet. I reached for my phone and checked the time. I sent him a text. "Did you come home?" There was no response. I waited. The footsteps moved from the kitchen into the dining room, then into the living room. I could hear somebody walking around downstairs. I sat up in bed. My bedroom door was closed. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt much more awake than I had a few seconds earlier. I tried calling my dad. It went straight to voicemail. That wasn't necessarily strange. He didn't always have his phone on him while working, and sometimes he'd leave it in his truck. I wasn't ready to admit what I was actually thinking. I heard the stairs, one step, then another. The person was coming upstairs. I got out of bed and locked my bedroom door. The doors in our house had those little push-button locks that you could lock from the inside. It wasn't exactly a secure door, but it was better than having nothing between me and whoever was downstairs. I backed away from the door and stood beside my bed. The footsteps continued up the stairs. They weren't sneaky. That was one of the things that bothered me. The person wasn't creeping up the stairs or trying to hide their footsteps. They were just walking normally, like somebody who belonged in the house. There was no reason for anybody to be upstairs at 3 in the morning, unless it was my dad. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They stopped. My bedroom was only a few feet from the top of the staircase. I stared at the door. I heard the person walk past my room. A shadow moved underneath the door. They stopped near my dad's bedroom. The handle moved. I heard the door open. The person went inside. If it was my dad, why wasn't he saying anything? And if it wasn't my dad, why was he opening doors? A few seconds later, the person came back into the hallway. They opened the bathroom door, closed it. Then they moved toward my room. I could see their feet through the gap beneath my door. I couldn't tell what kind of shoes they were wearing. All I could make out was a dark shape. Then the footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom. I stopped breathing. The person stood there. A bright light appeared underneath my door. It wasn't the hallway light. It was a flashlight. The beam moved slowly across the floor underneath the door. That's when I knew for sure that whoever was standing outside wasn't my dad. My dad didn't walk around the house with a flashlight. I already had my phone in my hand, and I was about to call 911. Before I could, the person spoke. It was a man's voice. "I know you're in there." I don't really know how to explain what happened to me mentally after that. There was somebody in my house. He knew I was upstairs. He knew which room I was in. And he had just told me that he knew. I couldn't see his face. I couldn't even see anything through the door except the flashlight moving across the floor. He tried the handle. The door didn't open. He tried again. That's when I realized how important it was that I'd locked it. If I hadn't, he would have been able to walk straight into my room. I pressed my phone against my chest and tried to unlock it without making any noise. The man tried the handle again. I finally got the phone unlocked. I was about to call 911 when I did something I still don't really understand. I screamed, just a scream as loud as I could make it. I remember yelling that my dad was home and that the police were coming. The man immediately let go of the handle. I heard his shoes move away from the door. Then he ran. I heard him running down the hallway and down the stairs. There was a loud bang downstairs. Then the back door opened. A few seconds passed before I finally called 911. There weren't any signs of forced entry. Police asked whether anybody else had a key. I told them my mom did. That made everything more complicated. Dad had changed some of the locks after she moved out, but I wasn't completely sure which ones he'd changed and which ones he hadn't. The officer asked me whether my mom had ever threatened us or done anything that made me think she might come back. I said no. Whatever problems we'd had with her leaving, there wasn't some huge fight happening between us. She'd moved on with her life, and she wasn't around the house anymore. The police searched the house and the surrounding yards. Didn't find anyone. There wasn't enough evidence to identify anyone. Mom still had a key, but I don't believe she had anything to do with it. She was living with the guy she'd left my dad for, and she wasn't around our house anymore. I don't even know if the person who entered was somebody who knew us. At the time, I was living near Morgantown, West Virginia, in a rental house with my girlfriend Bianca. I worked, and most of my days involved driving between different properties. It wasn't a bad job. It just meant I spent a lot of time in my truck. We'd been together for a little over 2 years and had moved into the house that summer. We were both in our late 20s and trying to save money, so neither of us had a particularly exciting life. My parents lived about 50 minutes away, and my younger brother was still living with them at the time. I saw them fairly often, especially during the winter, because my mother was constantly worried about me driving in bad weather. She'd actually called me earlier that evening. There was a winter storm moving through the area, and the forecast had already warned about several inches of snow. I told her I was leaving work soon and would be home before it got too bad. She gave me the usual speech about not driving too fast. I told her I knew. She said I'd say that and then drive too fast anyway. She wasn't completely wrong. I finished work around 8 that night. By the time I got into my truck, snow was already coming down pretty heavily. The roads weren't terrible, but they were getting covered quickly. Bianca had texted me while I was leaving work and asked if I wanted her to wait up for me. I told her no and said I'd probably be home within an hour. The route I normally took wasn't particularly complicated. I had to get through some less populated roads before reaching the main highway, then take another road toward our house. There was one stretch I didn't particularly like during bad weather. It was an older 2-lane road that ran through a heavily wooded area. There weren't many houses along it, and there were several curves. At night, it was extremely dark. There were long stretches without streetlights, and the trees came close enough to the road that it sometimes felt like you were driving through a tunnel. I wasn't afraid of it. I preferred it to the busier roads because there was less traffic. That night, the snow made everything look different. The trees were covered in white, and my headlights only seemed to illuminate a few yards ahead. Snow kept hitting the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. I had the heat on, some music playing, and one hand resting on the steering wheel. And that's when I caught sight of the woman. She was walking on the right side of the road, going in the same direction I was driving. I thought she was wearing some kind of light-colored pants. It took me a second to realize her legs were bare. She was barefoot. She was wearing looked like a thin white nightgown. It was definitely not something anyone should have been wearing outside in that weather. I slowed down immediately. There was no car that I could see. I drove alongside her for a few seconds and lowered my window slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't answer. She didn't even turn toward me, just kept walking. I slowed almost to a stop. "Do you need a ride?" She continued walking toward a section where the road curved and the trees became thicker. I thought she was in shock. I didn't want to get out because the road was slippery and I couldn't see very far ahead, but I also felt like I couldn't just drive away after seeing somebody walking barefoot through a snowstorm. I lowered the window a little more. "Do you need me to call somebody?" She still didn't respond. Then she stepped off the road. She walked directly toward the trees, into the woods. I watched her disappear between the trees. I sat there with my truck stopped. I figured there had to be a house somewhere nearby that I couldn't see. There were plenty of strange things that made more sense than anything supernatural. I eventually drove away. I remember thinking that if she really was in trouble, somebody else would probably come along behind me and see her too. I drove for like 20 minutes. By then, I'd almost completely forgotten about her. The snow was getting heavier, and I was concentrating more on the road. I had just come around a bend when I saw somebody standing on the side of the road. I immediately slowed down. It was the same woman. I knew it was her. I don't mean that she looked similar. I mean I recognized the exact same white dress and the same long dark hair. She was standing on the opposite side of the road this time. She wasn't walking. She was standing there. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. The first thing that went through my mind was that I'd somehow taken a wrong turn and ended up back where I'd been. I looked at the dashboard and then at the road signs because I thought maybe I'd missed something. But I knew I hadn't. I'd been driving continuously. There was no side road I'd taken, no turnaround, no shortcut, and there was no way she could have gotten from where I'd seen her 20 minutes earlier to where she was now. The distance between those 2 points was few miles, and the road was winding through the woods. Even if she'd somehow run the entire way, she couldn't have reached that spot ahead of me without crossing the road or passing me. I slowed down until I was almost crawling. She was standing about 10 or 15 feet from the road. Snow was falling around her. She wasn't moving. She lifted her head. I could see her face. I can't explain what was wrong with it. I've tried telling this story to people since it happened, and every time I get to this part, I end up saying the same thing. I don't know how to describe it. It looked like a woman's face, but there was something profoundly wrong with it. Her skin looked unnaturally pale, gray beneath my headlights. Her eyes were the first thing I noticed. They were open far wider, and she was staring at me. There was no expression I could recognize. Mouth was open, I think. I remember seeing her teeth, but even that doesn't really explain what disturbed me. There was something about the proportions of her face, something about the way she was looking at me. It looked like a face that was trying to imitate a human face without actually understanding what a human face was supposed to look like. That's the closest I can get. I wish I could give a better description. The second I saw her clearly, I screamed. I was embarrassed about that for a long time afterward, especially because I'm not somebody who normally reacts that way. But I don't care anymore. I screamed, put the truck into gear, and drove. I didn't stop. I drove faster than I should have considering the road conditions. The truck slid slightly around one of the curves, and that scared me almost as much as the woman had. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard. I kept telling myself that I hadn't seen what I thought I'd seen. There had to be some explanation. I went through every explanation I could think of. None of them explained how she'd gotten there. That was the part I couldn't get past. Eventually, I reached a better maintained road and pulled into a gas station that was still open. There were 2 other cars parked outside. I went inside and bought a bottle of water even though I wasn't thirsty, and sat in my truck for like 10 minutes before I finally called Bianca. I told her I was okay and that the roads were getting bad. She asked why I sounded strange. I told her I'd had a weird encounter with somebody walking along the road. Bianca immediately asked if I'd called the police. She got annoyed with me. She said that if there was a woman walking barefoot in a snowstorm, I should have called somebody. I agreed with her. I also didn't tell her the entire story. I didn't tell her about the face. I knew how it sounded. I knew what she'd say. I just eventually drove home. When I got there, Bianca was standing at the front door waiting for me. She took one look at me and asked what happened. I told her everything. This time I included the part about seeing the woman twice. She looked more concerned than I expected. She asked me if I was sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn. I told her I was sure. Eventually, we came up with the same explanations I'd already been telling myself. Maybe the snow had confused me. I went to bed that night without thinking I'd experienced anything paranormal. I thought I'd just seen something strange that I couldn't explain. It wasn't until a few days later that one of my friends, well, he said he'd heard things about that stretch of road. I'd never heard any of them. He told me there had been few serious accidents there. I started asking people about the road, not because I wanted to investigate it, mostly because I wanted to prove to myself that there was an explanation. I heard different versions of the same basic story. There were stories about crashes, ghosts. Some of those were obviously ordinary accidents caused by snow, ice, deer, speeding, or people driving while intoxicated. I don't believe every accident on that road had anything to do with a ghost. But there were enough stories about the woman that I stopped laughing. There were stories about people seeing someone in their headlights and then losing control of their vehicles. Again, I don't know how much of that was true. People tell stories. Stories grow. A car accident becomes a ghost story after enough people repeat it. I stopped driving it at night whenever I could. Bianca still remembers the night I came home. She says the strangest part was how badly I was shaking. I don't remember shaking. I remember being scared, obviously, but mostly I remember being confused. Years later, I don't think I'm afraid of ghosts in general. I'm not someone who sees every strange noise as paranormal. The first time I saw the woman, I watched her walk into the woods. 20 minutes later, she was few miles farther down the same road. She hadn't passed me. She couldn't have gotten there. I don't know what she was. And I know that if I ever see somebody barefoot in a snowstorm again, I'm calling the police from a safe distance and continuing straight home. And I'm never taking that road during a snowstorm again. I was living with my parents in North Carolina. I had dropped out of community college after a couple of semesters and was working at a store about 20 minutes from home. I unloaded trucks, stocked shelves, helped customers find things, and spent my Saturdays there because nobody else seemed to want those shifts. I wasn't really sure what I was doing with my life yet. Most of my friends were in pretty much the same position. None of us had much money, and there wasn't a whole lot to do on weekends unless somebody had a house we could hang out at. There was me, Terry, Luke, and Bobby. Terry was usually the one responsible for whatever stupid plan we ended up doing. He couldn't seem to sit at home for an entire evening without deciding that we needed to go somewhere. His dad owned a small piece of property out toward the foothills, probably 40 minutes from where we lived. There wasn't a house on it. It was mostly wooded, with an old single-wide trailer sitting toward the back. His dad had bought the trailer years earlier because he'd planned to fix it up and use it while hunting. He never really got around to doing much with it. It had electricity and running water, but nobody actually lived there. As far as Terry knew, his dad mostly used it to store things and occasionally spent a night there during hunting season. I'd been there once during the daytime, but I barely remembered the place. There were trees all around the property. You had to drive down a gravel road for a while and then take a rougher path through the woods to reach the trailer. One afternoon, Terry called me while I was getting off work. He asked what I was doing that night. I told him I didn't have anything planned. He said, "Want to stay at the trailer?" I thought he meant his house at first. When he explained which trailer he was talking about, I remembered the place. He said Luke and Bobby were already interested, and the plan was basically to take some food, drinks, sleeping bags, and spend the night. There was barely any cell service out there, no neighbors close by, and not much to do besides sit around and talk. I asked Terry if his dad knew. He said his dad had given him permission to go. That was good enough for me. I went home, ate dinner, told my parents I was staying at Terry's house, and packed a backpack. My mom asked whether we were going to be drinking. I told her no. That wasn't exactly true, although I wasn't planning on getting drunk. Well, you know. We met at Terry's house around 9. Once we were off the main road, everything got noticeably darker. There weren't many houses out there, and the headlights were basically the only thing lighting up the trees around us. Terry seemed completely comfortable. He'd been there a few times with his dad and knew the roads. He eventually turned onto the smaller path leading toward the trailer. The truck bounced around enough that Luke had to hold the cooler between his legs to keep it from sliding all over the place. The farther we went, the less it felt like we were anywhere near civilization. Eventually, the trees opened up enough for us to see the trailer. It was one of those long, Single-wide trailers with a small set of steps leading to the front door. Leaves had collected along the bottom, and some branches were touching the roof. Terry parked beside it. We all got out and stood there for a minute because it was surprisingly cold. It was just genuinely isolated. No traffic. Terry unlocked the door. The second he opened it, perfume. Really strong perfume. It was strong enough that I noticed it from the doorway. Luke actually took a step backward. "What the hell is that?" Terry looked confused. He said his dad didn't keep anything like that in the trailer. We went inside anyway. The place wasn't filthy, but it definitely looked like nobody had been living there recently. There was old furniture, boxes, hunting equipment, and a bunch of random things Terry's dad had apparently stored there. The perfume was strongest around the hallway. And the walls. Someone had drawn things on them. I don't remember what every symbol looked like. They weren't normal drawings, though. There were circles, strange lines, and shapes that looked almost like letters. You know where I'm getting at, like somebody had scratched them into the wall. Looked like somebody had been performing rituals in the trailer. Bobby laughed and said the place was haunted. The perfume was the only thing that bothered me. Terry called his dad. He didn't answer. Terry sent him a text asking whether somebody had been inside the trailer recently. A few minutes later, his dad called back. Terry put him on speaker. His dad said he hadn't been there for weeks and definitely hadn't left any perfume inside. He also said the writing on the walls wasn't something he'd put there. Terry asked if anybody else had a key. His dad said he didn't think so, but he told us not to worry about it and said we could leave if we didn't feel comfortable. We didn't leave. That was the first really stupid decision we made that night. At the time, though, we were 4 guys in our early 20s sitting inside a trailer in the woods. The conversation about the drawings quickly turned into jokes again. We figured maybe a previous owner had drawn them. The trailer had been bought used, and Terry didn't know its entire history. So we decided to stay. We moved some boxes around and started eating. We settled in. We were sitting around the living room drinking and talking while some movie played on the television. Nobody was paying much attention to it. Around midnight, Terry muted the television. We all looked at him. He was listening. There was something outside. It sounded like footsteps somewhere farther away. We waited. Seconds later, we heard a crunching sound coming from the direction of the driveway. A few seconds later, a person appeared between the trees. It was a man. He was walking toward the trailer. The way he was walking, he wasn't wandering around like somebody who'd accidentally stumbled onto the property. He was coming toward us. We watched him through the window. He looked thin and was wearing dark clothes. Terry stood up and moved toward the window. The man stopped. Neither side moved. Even from where we were standing, it was obvious he'd noticed all 4 of us. He ran. He turned around and took off into the trees. What the hell? Terry immediately went to the door and locked it. He called his dad again, explained what had happened. His dad sounded surprised. He told us there shouldn't have been anybody out there and that we needed to stay inside. He said he would try to figure out whether somebody had been using the property without permission. We asked if he wanted us to leave. He told us to use our judgment, but if we did leave, we needed to leave together. That was enough for us to start taking the situation more seriously. We didn't go outside. We kept the lights on and stayed together in the living room. For about an hour, nothing happened. Eventually, we started talking ourselves into the idea that the man probably wasn't dangerous. Maybe he'd been using the property because he knew the trailer was empty. The perfume suddenly seemed less mysterious, too. We started wondering whether somebody had actually been staying in the trailer without Terry's dad knowing. If somebody had been staying there, it would explain the perfume and maybe even the strange drawings. We still didn't know who the man was, but we had something that at least sounded like an explanation. Sometime later, we heard something from the trees. Sounded like somebody making a strange noise. I can't really describe it. It wasn't yelling, it was like talking. There would be a few low sounds, then silence, then another sound. All 4 of us looked toward the windows. Nobody wanted to open the door. After a while, Luke whispered that he thought somebody was outside. I looked toward the front window and saw a face between the trees. It was the same man. He was wearing something over his face, a dark mask. He was standing there looking toward the trailer. We watched him through the window. He started walking toward the trailer. Terry quietly told everyone to get away from the windows. We moved toward the back of the trailer. The man reached the steps. He stopped outside the door. Then he started hitting it. The first hit wasn't enough to break anything. The second one shook the whole frame, hit the door again. The frame cracked. We were already grabbing our stuff when the door finally gave way. But the man didn't come inside. He stood there, looking into the trailer. Then he ran. He disappeared into the darkness almost as quickly as he'd appeared. We were all standing there trying to understand what had just happened. Terry had his phone out and was trying to call his dad again. We heard the man's voice outside. He was talking. It sounded like he was having a conversation with somebody who wasn't there. I remember hearing him laugh once. Then everything went quiet. We waited. A few seconds later, he appeared again. This time he was holding a knife. He was still wearing the mask. He stood few yards from the trailer and looked toward us. Then he started talking to himself again. We stopped trying to figure out what was happening. We just needed to get out. Terry shouted for everyone to move. We grabbed whatever we could and ran out the back of the trailer. Nobody had assigned themselves a direction or decided who was doing what. We just ran. The truck was parked in front of the trailer, which meant we had to go around the side to reach it. I remember being terrified that the man was going to appear from the other side, but we couldn't see him. We reached the truck. Everyone piled inside. Bobby had dropped one of his shoes somewhere and didn't even bother going back for it. We drove down the path with the headlights bouncing across the trees. Once we reached the gravel road, Terry called 911. He explained what had happened and gave them the location. We drove toward the main road while staying on the phone with the dispatcher. They took our statements separately. They had searched the trailer and the surrounding property, but there was no sign of him. They did find signs that somebody had probably been staying around the trailer. There were some things inside that Terry's dad said weren't his. They found the damaged door. The symbols on the walls were there. Nobody could tell us who had drawn them. I never went back. Nobody ever figured out who that man was. Terry's dad suspected somebody had been using the trailer when he wasn't around, and the police apparently thought the same thing. There wasn't enough evidence to say that the man actually lived there permanently, but there were enough signs to suggest he'd been spending time around the property. The perfume made a little more sense after that. Maybe there had been a woman staying there at some point, or somebody else had been there before him. We never found out. The first time we saw him, he was walking toward the trailer like he expected it to be empty.